Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Palais, and thanks for being with us. I'm excited. We've got a three-part episode today. This year, there are 11 gubernatorial elections on the ballot. Most of these contests aren't expected to be too competitive. Two of them, New Hampshire and North Carolina, are about as close as they can get. And we'll have two reporters on the show who will talk through what they are seeing in New Hampshire and North Carolina. We'll take a closer look at those elections. And then at the end, in our third part, we'll have Ballotpedia's own Glorie Martinez for an overview of the 9 other races and some recent history, trifecta statuses, and more. So first, let's take a look at North Carolina. I'm joined now by Dawn Vaughan, who is the State Capitol Bureau Chief at the News Observer in North Carolina. Dawn, thanks for joining us today on this wonderful Thursday when we're recording this and watching the hurricane come barreling toward us in the Carolinas, but hopefully we're right. How are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. So, and obviously with this election, everything changes pretty regularly. We're recording this on Thursday, so keep that in mind with the conversation that we're having, listeners. 3 of the past 4 governor elections in North Carolina have been decided by 5 points or fewer. So North Carolina is one of the 11 governor elections up this year, and it's one of the usual tight races. So tell our listeners a little bit about what are the issues that are front of mind in North Carolina.
Really, abortion is a big issue in the governor's race, but really North Carolina and nationally, polling shows that economic issues are what's most important to everybody. And because elections are so close in North Carolina, Trump and Biden were separated by less than 1.5% in the last election, that a lot of it comes down to personality and then what everybody says turnout. But it really does sway things because the margins are so small.
Yeah, do you find that the voters in North Carolina this year are more interested in the national sort of federal issues, or are there sort of distinctly unique things to North Carolina that are driving people's interests?
What's interesting is that the North Carolina voters barely picked Trump over Biden, but they also reelected Democratic Governor Roy Cooper. And what we were looking at even before, like a lot of everything, the latest in the governor's race was that North Carolina could barely go for Trump, but then pick Democrat Attorney General Josh Stein, who's the candidate for governor. Just because of these little issues, some of the abortion law, the legislature here is Republican supermajority, and they passed an abortion restrictions law, I guess, last year. And it's after the first trimester, so it's much less strict than some other states, but obviously a lot more strict than other states. So that is an issue as a factor in everything because of the Republican candidate wanting a much stricter abortion law.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's interesting. And North Carolina has 6 pivot counties, which pivot counties are the ones that went Obama 2008, Obama 2012, and then Trump 2016. So yeah, there aren't many states that have, these sort of like split ticket sort of style counties, but North Carolina is certainly a very purple state, and you're certainly pointing that out. What have the polls been over recent weeks in the in North Carolina's election?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, Josh Stein is the Democratic candidate. He's the Attorney General versus Lieutenant Governor Republican Mark Robinson. Even before the big scandal break, Stein was up double digits over Robinson. We reported on 2 major polls this week with North Carolina voters that were the same. It's at least double digits for Stein, the Democrat, in the governor's race versus the Attorney General's race is a little tighter. And those are both sitting members of Congress that are running. And the presidential race is pretty tight too. But part of the reason that the gap in the polls is happening now, where a few months ago it was a little tighter, is that people just weren't paying attention as much because the national politics gets, the most attention across the board. And now that the election is drawing closer, people start paying more attention and deciding who they like and who they don't.
North Carolina is the one state that was won by a Democratic governor candidate, to your point that you said earlier, and a state that Trump won in 2020. So what other key issues do you think voters are going to be paying attention to in the final 5-week sprint to the election?
Like I said before, with the economic issues, one of the polls that we wrote about was commissioned by AARP, and the economic issues are things from Social Security to Medicare to cost of utilities, cost of housing. North Carolina is consistently growing, especially the urban areas. People are moving here constantly from other places in the country, which has caused a real a real housing problem. And just the price of real estate here is really out of control for people that buy. And so housing is both a local and statewide issue that comes into play for everybody. And then just the cost of anything and who you think is going to have some sort of solution there. Of course, the state doesn't set things the way that the federal government does as far as taxes. But because I'd mentioned about Republicans having control of the legislature, they've been reducing the individual income tax rate over the past couple of years. But then they're also reducing corporate tax rate, which makes things long range.
Yeah, on the economic issues, are either the gubernatorial candidates splitting from the national themes? Is Stein sort of keeping in line with what the Harris campaign is putting forth for economic solutions? Is Robinson keeping in line with what Trump's putting forward? Or are either the state level candidates kind of doing things their own way and saying this is what North Carolina needs, regardless of what the federal candidates are saying?
No, it's straight party. So Stein is, had been the heir apparent to the Governor Cooper for a long time. They've worked together for a long time. Stein worked for Cooper when Cooper was Attorney General. Their policy is almost exactly the same, if not exactly the same. And they're big Biden and then Harris supporters now. And Robinson really basically rose to fame because he was endorsed by Donald Trump. And he is just trying to ride that out through the election, saying that he's in line with it. And as of the time of recording this, Trump has not pulled his endorsement.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things, that we always pay attention to at Ballotpedia is lieutenant governor and governors on the same ticket. So there are some states where they run on the same ticket. In some states, they do not, like North Carolina. And Robinson won in 2020 at the same time that voters selected a Democratic governor. So these voters' mandate to the governor's executive cabinet was essentially, we'd like to see two different parties in the governor lieutenant governor spot.
Right.
That was an interesting election. And he won by about 3 points in 2020. So what was different, do you think, in 2020 versus now for Robinson's campaign?
Yeah, I mean, big picture, the people in the party, like voters don't, it's still a statewide election, but they don't really care as much who the lieutenant governor is. They probably looked them up like 5 minutes before voting, to be frank, and how that goes. And Robinson, there was a very crowded Republican primary that year, and he won because he had gone viral for this pro-gun rights video speech that he gave at the Greensboro City Council. So he beat other, establishment or upstart candidates. And then I think it was, just party line, maybe those people that picked Trump and then decided they wanted to reelect the Democratic governor, just, switched again by the time they went further down ballot. So that was, a little bit of that maybe people knew some about Robinson, but not as much. He is also the first Black lieutenant governor of North Carolina. That's important to note. He would be the first Black governor of North Carolina. Of course, most, Black voters are trend Democrat, not Republican. But historically, a lot of people see lieutenant governor role in North Carolina has almost nothing to do. They're supposed to preside over the Senate. Lieutenant governors don't always do that. They only vote in the case of a tie. They sit on a couple of boards. They basically kind of use it to get attention, really. And Robinson hasn't really shown up for even a lot of those jobs, of those presiding over the Senate and those meetings. So he hasn't done a lot to kind of base like his past years on. So it's more like you look at national issues.
Yeah, it's interesting. Every lieutenant governor is so different. And you're so right that there are so many voters who hopefully they're on Ballotpedia getting ready, looking up their candidates right at the polls. But we see that a lot in our traffic. That's certainly the case. So any last points that our listeners should know about this election this cycle?
Well, obviously Robinson is national news now. He denies the allegations, but almost all of his campaign staff resigned a few days ago. And now half of his staff in Lieutenant Governor's office who have been with him since before he was even in office, they all resigned too.
Yeah, so when the staff resigned like that, and I remember I saw that story recently, was he able to go immediately replace them with a new staff, or is his campaign essentially operating staffless now? And obviously that could change by the time it's released.
Yeah, there's rumblings of who he's already, trying to get to replace them. But they made a couple $1 million off of them, these two different advisor groups, and which included a lot of staff, except really a campaign spokesperson or two as far as who's left. And then the lieutenant governor office, like I said, the job by design doesn't have much to do, but he had just promoted his deputy chief of staff to replace the chief of staff.
Never a dull moment. I'm grateful for your time today, Dawn. Thanks for coming on the show, and get some sleep in the next few weeks as you cover the last bit of the election cycle.
Right. You too. Thanks.
Thank you. Listeners, stay tuned. We'll be right back with Madison Fernandez, who is an elections reporter at Politico, to help us break down what many believe will be this year's tightest gubernatorial election in New Hampshire.
Hi there, I'm Hannah Nelson, the External Relations Manager at Ballotpedia. We're excited to kick off our Ballotpedia Society membership campaign to grow our incredible community of monthly donors who make our work possible. Ballotpedia Society members are crucial in helping us expand our tools and resources to provide voters with accurate and reliable information to make informed decisions at the ballot box. This monthly support is vital as we deliver neutral, easy-to-understand content to millions of Americans. As a BPS member, you'll enjoy exclusive updates and insider access to insights from our expert team. Ready to join? Head over to donate.ballotpedia.org/ontheballot2024. Again, that website is donate.ballotpedia.org/ontheballot2024 to make your donation today. Thank you for being such an important part of our mission. We couldn't do it without you.
Madison, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really looking forward to talking about New Hampshire. I love New Hampshire. It's such an interesting state to cover politically. Small little corner of the country, but one of the most fascinating state politics environments. There are 400 members of the state house, and it's one of those states that changes control pretty regularly. It's been a trifecta for Republicans for 4 years now, but we had divided government for a couple of years before that. Then there were some Republican trifectas before that, divided government. There were Democratic trifectas from 2007 to 2010. So this is a state that voters are always pretty interesting to see what they want to decide come election time. So we're going to talk a little about the New Hampshire governor's election today. So Madison, you've been covering that closely for Politco. So tell us about what you've seen up in New Hampshire.
Yeah, I mean, and one thing I'll say on New Hampshire that is also interesting, it's one of those states that, especially in a presidential year, everyone has their eyes on it in the beginning of the year, then they sort of forget about New Hampshire. But it really is so interesting, and especially they have their state primary at the end of the cycle. It was just in the beginning of this month, and also this election fell on the same day as the presidential debate. So,
right.
You know, it's always fighting for attention, but it should have some. So, with the governor's race, we have Kelly Ayotte on the Republican side. She's the former senator, and she's running against Joyce Craig, the former Manchester mayor, who's a Democrat. And political control in this state really goes back and forth. If you go back to 2016, when the last time there was an open governor's race, Republicans just narrowly won. So it's going to be a really, really tight race if we're going by those standards. So a bit about the primary, too. On the Republican side, Ayotte had a lot of challengers, but she got through pretty easily. You know, it helps that she had that name ID. And she also had the endorsement of outgoing Governor Chris Sununu, who's also a Republican. And on the Democrat side, it was a little more contentious. You know, one of the big storylines that I found really interesting was, you know, there are these accusations between the two main candidates being thrown around about who's to blame for the opioid crisis. You know, it's stuff like that you don't really see in a Democratic primary. And I know there was some concerns about, oh, will this hurt Dems in the general, especially since it's so close. But you know how these things go in primaries. People usually move on pretty quickly and coalesce around the party's nominee.
Yeah, they do, don't they? So, yeah, you're right. So you spoke about 2016. So that was a 2-point win for Republicans that cycle. And then Sununu won re-election in 2020 by more than 30 points. He got 65% of the vote in 2020. So tell us a little bit about why is the race open? Why is he not running for re-election?
So there are no term limits in New Hampshire, and he could have ran again if he wanted to, but he spent the good chunk of last year flirting with running for president, and then he sort of turned his attention to being anti-Donald Trump and supporting Nikki Haley, and now he's supporting Trump because a lot of Republicans are. But that being said, he decided not to run again because he said he wanted to focus on other things. But the thing with Chris Sununu and, you know, coming from such a political family, I don't think this will be the last we see of him. Not really sure what he'll do next. But yeah, he chose not to run for re-election, even though he could have.
Something I'm always curious about when we look at the state level elections is whether or not the national issues are carrying the day. So in New Hampshire, when you're covering this race, do you find that the voters are more interested in talking about, sort of state level topics, or the national issues that Kamala Harris and Donald Trump talking about? Are those what are essentially carrying the day with the candidates and with the voters?
I think it's a really interesting split here on both sides. So Democrats are leaning really heavily into abortion because we've seen time and time again that this is a successful issue for them, especially in governor's races. Look back to Kentucky last year with Andy Beshear, who ran so heavily on abortion in a red state, and he won re-election. So Democrats are definitely using that. And I would say abortion is a national issue to hit Ayotte, but Ayotte spent a lot of the Republican primary trying to sort of get ahead of these attacks. Of course, it's not going to stop them, but she's been very clear about her position. She says she supports the current law in the state, and she actually has tried to turn the tables on Democrats, saying that they're politicizing this, they're playing games with women. So I think that's a really interesting message that she's been crafting. But at the same time, she's also relying a lot on local issues, in part because Joyce Craig was mayor. So she points to Craig's positions on taxes. And, one of her recent ads has something saying that she wanted to raise her own salary when she was mayor. So you sort of have both of these local and national issues going on at the same time. And the local ones, I think, are really relevant because Craig was just mayor, up until earlier this year.
Yeah, it's very interesting because in New Hampshire, they're 2-year terms for the governor. So they're kind of having to run and then rerun pretty frequently. It doesn't give the governors a lot of time to sort of focus on their term, so to speak. Does that come up at all? Is that interest voters, the 2-year versus 4-year cycle?
I mean, I think it's one of those things that voters are just used to at this point. But something that Ayotte is also saying that is interesting to me is that she's saying she's going to continue on the Sununu path. So to that sort of point of, just 2 years before I run again, she's relying on an entire tenure that Sununu had before and sort of building that into her own. So I think that's sort of interesting.
What does polling and campaign finance show us? What are we seeing in New Hampshire?
It's a tight race for the governor's race. Presidential, less so. We see the vice president is ahead of Donald Trump. But like we said at the top, we knew this governor's race was going to be tight. So on the money front, what I'm really keeping an eye on here is how much national money is going to be flowing in. We already had a lot in the primary. A group backed by the Democratic Governors Association, they already put in $9 million. That's a lot of money for a primary. And yes, of course, it was a late primary, but still, that is a really big investment because they see this as a potential pickup. And the Republican Governors Association, as far as I can tell, I have not seen any independent expenditures, but they did put $2 million into Ayotte's campaign in the primary. But the dynamic that I'm interested in now is that this race is going to be the one that is probably the most competitive this cycle now that everything that's going on with North Carolina and Democratic Attorney General Josh Stein seemingly pulling ahead there, given Mark Robinson's many scandals. So what I'm interested in seeing in the coming weeks is, are some of those national dollars going to shift over to New Hampshire? From what I'm trying to ask around on right now, I'm not really sure because a lot of these folks don't like to preempt and forecast their plans. But I think that a lot of the attention, even if not just money, a lot of the attention is going to be on New Hampshire now because I think some folks are seeing North Carolina somewhat written off as a win for Democrats at this point.
Yeah, that's something we covered earlier in the episode, is that there's only 11 gubernatorial elections this year, and most of them are in pretty safe states. So the vast majority of gubernatorial elections occur in the midterm cycles. So it does make you wonder if, will a bunch of gubernatorial money sort of hang out until next cycle then? That's quite a bit of campaign finance pouring into a little state like New Hampshire for a 2-year term. I don't remember how much money was spent in prior cycles here, but I can't imagine it was that much. I know our most recent numbers we have are that Ayotte has raised almost $8 million for her campaign, and Craig has raised a little more than $3 million. So that's quite a lot of money up there, because when you talk to the New Hampshire voters, and I always enjoy talking to them about the state house elections where they have 400 members, none of them raise any money because they just go door to door. So it's a very different environment. They just, I just run into my rep down at the grocery store, and that's how they campaign. So yeah, for those states like New Hampshire, that's a lot of campaign finance activity.
Yeah, and I'm even just looking at the future ad reservations from the primary through the election. I mean, Ayotte has put in close to $6 million on TV, which is, again, a lot of money. You know, you have the state parties helping out both of them. Dems altogether have around $6 million on the airwaves. So, I mean, again, like you said, this is a ton of money being put in for a 2-year term. But I think the rationale is once you have this, you know, you're going to stick around for a while.
Yeah, it does seem like that in New Hampshire. So very interesting. It's going to be a pretty fun election to watch. Anything else that our listeners should know about New Hampshire's elections that we haven't covered yet?
Another big line of attack from Democrats is the fact that Ayotte back in 2016 disavowed Donald Trump after the Access Hollywood tapes. And this year she said she's backing him. So Democrats are trying to really call her out on that and calling it a flip-flop. And I think that is interesting when you look at the national polls that Harris is running so far ahead of Trump, because Dems are trying to nationalize that and tie Ayotte to Trump. And I guess we'll see if it ties her down. I do think that voters see them as distinct races, but Democrats are trying to make them one and the same.
Yeah, New Hampshire voters are certainly one of those voting blocks that seems to vote on a pretty individualized scale, as we see from presidential elections where they actually split their tickets, which we don't see in very many states anymore. So yeah, it's a very interesting election, just a handful of weeks away. So we'll be sure to keep following along with your coverage, Madison. And thanks a lot for taking the time to join us on the episode today.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to take one more quick break. When we come back, I'll be joined by Ballotpedia's Glorie Martinez with an overview of the other 9 gubernatorial races that will be happening this fall and more. Stay tuned.
Hi, Allison here from Ballotpedia's communications team, and I've got something new and exciting that I want to tell you about today. Whether you are a seasoned voter like me, I've been voting for more than 40 years, or if you're voting for the first time this November, our new election voter toolkit is here to help with everything you need to get prepared for voting. We want you to feel great about casting your ballot, and what we mean by great is that you're able to vote with confidence. Within our toolkit, you'll find personalized voting information, our sample ballot, election calendars, state-specific information sheets, ballot measure information, and ballot measures can be really quite complicated, and so we also provide content about ballot measures to help you understand a little bit more about what they mean in layperson's terms, which is super helpful, and our help desk to help answer any questions you may have about the voting process. So we've got it all, and I think you're going to love it. Your vote matters, and we're here for it, and we've got you covered.
Okay, Glorie, thanks for being here to wrap up this episode. Good to see you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
This is your first even year election cycle with us. Are you excited?
Oh my gosh. Yes. I'm a little intimidated, but very excited.
You're surrounded by a team with a lot of veterans who have been around for a number of even year cycles, so you will be well taken care of. But I always love hearing about everyone's sort of stories from their first even year cycle with Ballotpedia. So,
Yeah, hopefully I'll come out of this with some good ones.
Well, you'll get more sleep than you probably will expect because we take good care about that, unlike our early years here. Those are stories for another day, though. Let's talk about our gubernatorial elections now. So just to tell our listeners a little more background. Now, they've already heard from some experts on specific races in North Carolina and in New Hampshire, but what's going on in the other 9 states?
So yes, North Carolina and New Hampshire are definitely considered the most competitive elections this year. All of the other 9 states that are holding elections are rated solid or safe by one party or another. And that's according to at least 2 of the 3 outside political ratings outlets that Ballotpedia monitors, which again, those are the Cook's Political Report, Sabato's Crystal Ball, and Inside Elections. Most of these states had their last gubernatorial elections in 2020. Incumbents won the majority of the races. The only exceptions were Utah and Montana, and that exception was due to the fact that incumbent governors either didn't file for re-election or they were unable to because of term limits. So Delaware is rated a solid Democratic race, and Washington State is Democratic as well. But the other 7 states are pretty solidly Republican.
Let's talk about term limits there, because you just mentioned that. So are term limits playing a factor in this year's elections? And I think one thing that I always find interesting about governorships is there are quite a few states with term limits. With state legislatures, there are 16 states with term limits. Obviously, in Congress, there are no term limits. But what about with governorships and term limits? What do we see there?
Right. So it's different across many states. Most states do have term limits and different timelines of how long a governor can be in office per term and how many terms they're allowed to have.
It's amazing. 37 states, right? I mean, you said Russell, 37 states have term limits on governors. I'm not sure that most of our listeners would realize that. What are we seeing in particular this year? Are any of the governors this year termed out?
So yeah, most of these governorships that are up for election do have term limits. They're typically limited to 2 4-year terms or 8 years total in office. Vermont and New Hampshire actually are the exceptions in this case. They don't have term limits, but they're also the only states where governors serve 2-year terms rather than 4-year terms.
Yeah, and Vermont is such an interesting case. Phil Scott is the Republican governor there, and he won in 2020 by 47 points in the same year that Joe Biden won Vermont by 35 points. So one of the largest sort of party split gaps I think we've probably ever had in a statewide election. So Vermont, it's a very interesting state, much like New Hampshire, which, listen to whoever we just talked about previously on the episode. So let's talk then a little bit more about the history of these governorships. Of the 11 states holding elections this year, which of these states has had the same party in the governor's mansion for the longest?
So interestingly, it's a tie. Utah and Washington have had the same party in control since 1985, and that's Republicans for Utah and Democrats for Washington.
That's a long time for single party control, and in some of those states, they've had trifectas for almost that same exact time period as well. North Dakota's got a similar length of time with the same party since 1992, and Delaware since 1993. So a lot of the governorships have been same party control for a while now. How many of the incumbents are running for re-election this year? I think it's 3. Is that right?
Yes, it's actually a lot lower than a typical year. Only 3 incumbents are running, and that's the governor of Montana, Utah, and Vermont.
Very interesting, especially because if listeners listen to our recent episode on the competitiveness index, we know that for state legislative elections, the incumbents run for re-election 85% of the time. In Congress, incumbents run for re-election 85% of the time. So it's very interesting when you look at the governor's mansion, how sort of starkly different those elections are. Let's talk about party control over the last 40 years or so as well. There's been a number of different inflection points when party control of governors has changed, but let's first just start with this. So how many governors' mansions right now are controlled by Republicans and how many are controlled by Democrats heading into the election?
So currently, we have a majority of Republican governors with 27 governorships to the Democrats' 23. Like you said, there have been a number of significant points of change over the past 40 years or so. We can look back at 1994 when there were 29 Republican governors to the Democrats' 20. And interestingly, Republicans held that lead until about 2006. So quite a few years there before the next sort of shift started to happen. And that was with 28 Republican governors to 22 Democratic governors.
Yeah, we're looking at our line chart for listeners right now. We've got a nice little line chart on Ballotpedia on our governor's elections page. It looks kind of like a DNA strand, the way it's kind of wrapped around itself. So then there was a couple other inflection points, I think, in 2010 and 2018, right?
Yes. So after 2006, we actually ended up having 28 Democratic governors the next year in 2007 to Republicans 22. But then going down a couple more years, we see it start to change again. We have 26 Democratic governors and Republicans are at 23. And the lines are sort of crisscrossing again. And you see Republicans once again on the rise. And then we head down to 2018 and it's pretty large gap. We have 33 Republican governors to only 16 Democrats.
The highest point since 1977 for Republicans was 2018 when, like you just said, there were 33 Republican governors. And the highest point for Democrats was back in 1978. There were actually 37 Democratic governors. So it's pretty interesting to see the sort of ebb and flow of control of state houses. We kind of often find that We all have sort of short-term memories, and it can feel like, oh, the party control of a state today is probably what it's always been, right? And that's sometimes true, like say Utah and Washington, like we were talking about, but a lot of states do change sort of cyclically, so to speak.
Right,
So,
definitely.
what else do we need to know about the governor's elections this year?
So going back to your point about less incumbents running this year than usual, that will have a pretty interesting impact, most likely, on this election, because running incumbents usually have a pretty big advantage going into any race. For example, in the 2022 gubernatorial elections, only one incumbent lost, while 27 others were reelected, which is a pretty big gap, once again, as you can see. Of the remaining 8 open races that year, 5 were won by candidates from the incumbent's party and only 3 by candidates of the opposing party. So we can see, again, the big influence that incumbents have, even when they're not running sometimes, the influence they have for their party as well. Looking at 2020, the election before that, there was a similar pattern, less races overall, but incumbents did win 9 out of those 11 races. And only one governorship, which was Montana, changed party control due to the incumbent being term limited. So this just goes to show, again, that incumbents usually have a really strong chance of winning unless they are prevented by term limits or outside circumstances like resignation.
Yeah, and ultimately, the control of governorships will impact trifectas. Trifecta is when one party controls governorship and the state legislature. And trifectas are important because they allow that party in control to have a much clearer pathway towards setting and enacting its policy agenda. So what trifectas could be either at stake this year as a result of the governor's elections, or, it couldn't go from divided to trifectas. And obviously bearing in mind that state legislatures in those elections play a really big role in that. And we'll have a different episode coming up later on in our election preview season, where we'll talk specifically about the chambers that are sort of at stake. But what governor elections might play a part in trifecta statuses this year?
Honestly, for all of the non-competitive states that are holding gubernatorial elections this year, they all have trifectas, and they all don't really seem likely to be affected by this gubernatorial election. We have Delaware and Washington holding strong with their Democratic trifectas, and most likely that will not change based on the predictions of who's going to win this governor's race. And the other states also holding elections, we have Indiana, Missouri, Montana, North Dakota, Utah, and West Virginia. They're all Republican trifectas, and once again, most likely to continue keeping their Republican governors in power. So we're probably not going to see many changes to those trifectas.
Great. Well, Glorie, thanks so much for coming on the show and for taking the time to walk through the other gubernatorial elections. And coming up in a few weeks, we'll start tracking the results. So have a great rest of your election season. See you soon on the show.
Of course. Thank you so much.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our gubernatorial coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back this week with a lot more for you. Coverage of the vice presidential debate, as well as more on trending ballot measures. Always one of our favorite subjects. Make sure you're subscribed to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Palais. Thanks for listening.